Hi, let's make a start. Welcome to our third and final webinar in this culture series. I'd like to introduce you to Lorraine Farah and Anthony Garbett. They're my colleagues and they'll be supporting all of us through this process. Lorraine, do you want to perhaps just say a few words and introduce yourself?
Fantastic. Thank you, Ian. I will. Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all well today. This is our third and final plan that we're doing, Culture Lab that we're running in our masterclass series. And I may have met some of you in our first or our second one. So I look forward to supporting Ian as we talk through what it takes and what are some of the components for you to think about as you build a culture plan. We're both delighted to be here with you.
Thanks, Lorraine. A little bit about myself for those that haven't been on earlier calls. I've been working with Walking the Talk now for 10 or 12 years. I've been consulting more broadly for about 15. And I came to consulting after a long corporate career working with ExxonMobil globally. And to make the transition from that corporate life to consulting, I went back to uni and did a postgrad and a master's in psychology. This webinar is going to focus very much on how one might go about building a culture plan, and in particular, how we might support organisations as they develop a culture plan. Please feel free to ask questions as we work through the deck. We will also have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. If you wish to ask a question, please just pop it into the chat function, and Lorraine will be monitoring those and sharing her wisdom with us around each of those questions. So let's make a start. So who are we? We're Walking the Talk. We're a global consulting business with more than 30 years supporting clients as they seek to understand and then shift their culture. We're now part of the ZIG company, which is a global human resources and talent consultancy based in the US. And our mission, as is shown on the slide, is to make culture doable. You know, we, perhaps unlike some consultants, really like to do ourselves out of a job. When we work with clients, it's as much about a knowledge transfer as it is anything else. So that once the engagement is finished, there's folks within your organisation that have the knowledge and wherewithal to be able to manage the culture going forward. So a little bit about Walking the Talk. As I've just mentioned, we've been helping organisations transform their cultures for more than 30 years now. And over that time, we've developed a robust series of methodologies and a really deep understanding of what it takes to transform culture. And we really do, as I've said, help organisations manage this process themselves. In effect, we're teaching them how to fish. We have provided thought leadership in this space for all of those 30 years through research and publication. We've been at the cutting edge of culture and its relationship to organisational success, and how leaders in particular can get involved with and help drive those cultural shifts that organisations need to undertake. As much as possible, we try and do this in a simple and jargon-less way. We like to keep things simple so that it's accessible to all in your organisations, and it's not just the domain of consultants like us. When we think about culture and the work we've done over the last 30 years, it is always focused on improving performance. For us, culture isn't necessarily a soft and fluffy thing. It's very much an enabler of strategy. And it's through that enabling of strategy that we help organisations improve their performance. And in doing that, we'd like to think that it delivers sustainable results. It isn't just a flash in the pan outcome that we're looking for. We're looking for true organisational transformation enabled by culture. So why culture planning? Why dive into this? Why look at it at all? Well, what we've found over time is that the success we just spoke of doesn't happen in a vacuum. If you think about the bottom of this slide, you can see that all organisations are going to have a series of business priorities or strategic imperatives that are effectively their roadmap for the next 3 to 5 years. And when they don't have a culture plan, what can happen is that there's underperformance against those strategic goals, and there's no real transformation that occurs. And if it does occur, it's typically delayed. And often, because culture hasn't been something they're specifically focused on, they also will experience lower engagement. Whereas the clients that we work with, when we help them develop that culture plan that's aligned to those business priorities, we do see improved performance. We do see accelerated transformation of culture. And typically that's coupled with higher levels of engagement. So in short, what we've found is organisations that do invest in culture planning are much more likely to achieve the strategic business outcomes that they've set themselves. To put this all into perspective, it's probably helpful just to pause and reframe the conversation a little through this idea of culture and what it really is and isn't. If you jumped onto Google now and you did a quick search, what is culture, you'd probably end up with thousands of definitions. The definition that we favour and we've found is most helpful for our clients is that culture is actually the patterns of behaviour that are encouraged, discouraged, or tolerated by people and systems over time. So there's a couple of elements in that that are worth breaking down. The first is that it's the pattern of normed behaviours across the organisation. So when we work with clients around culture, what we're really interested in is not a series of one-off events or behaviours that may be localised. We think about culture as those behaviours that are global across the firm. And those behaviours, as is indicated here, are often encouraged by leaders or discouraged. But perhaps the most salient point there is the idea of sometimes behaviours are tolerated, and it's those behaviours that you tolerate, that you don't call out, that most often end up shaping your culture. So you do have to think about not just the overt behaviours that you'll encourage and discourage, but getting really good at stopping tolerating behaviours that are not reflective of the culture that you're after. And that encouragement, and discouragement is really driven through people and systems. So for example, how leaders show up, what they role model sends a very clear signal around the behaviours that are required within the culture. But the systems also play a big part. The easiest example of that would be to think about your REM structure. So what you reward is typically what you get. And if you're not rewarding the behaviours that you want in your culture, maybe it's time to come back to the drawing board. And it needs to be sustained over time. So when we talk about culture for the rest of the webinar, this is the definition that we're really leaning on. Now, it's interesting when you think about it, the culture is shaped in the way that I just described, but it's shaped through this spoken and unspoken messages at 3 levels: the behaviours, the systems, and the symbols within the firm or within the organisation. And just to give you a bit of clarity around that, how might we think about that? As I've said a moment ago, what behaviours are role models? Sorry, what behaviours are leaders role modelling? How are meetings, conferences, and emails configured? How are they held? How are they shared? And just the interactions with others. There's a whole lot of unspoken and spoken messages that are related to behaviours, and there's just 3, I suppose, sources of that. If we think about symbols, perhaps the 2 biggest symbolic indicators of what is important in the culture is how money is spent and where time is allocated. So if you think about it, you might say your people are super important, but when your organization hits hard times and you start cutting training budgets, what signal does that send about how important people truly are? Those symbolic messages are often more powerful because they are almost absorbed at a subconscious level, and in that way linger and create a lasting impression. And finally, as I mentioned a moment ago, the key organisational and business systems that you have will also shape the culture in a variety of ways. So let's make this a little bit interactive. I'd like to open up this poll to everybody. Please grab a device, scan that QR code, and answer this question. A good culture plan is ... And feel free to tick, flick, say yes to as many of these items or as few as you like. So let's give people a moment to populate that quiz. We'll give people a moment or two longer to complete that. We've got 13 responses so far. We've got about another 13 to go, I think, based on how many people are on the call. Just give people a minute longer. Let's just go through those responses if we can. There may be a few stragglers, but let's just barrel in and see where we land. So perhaps unsurprisingly, 94% of folks have said yes to organisational behaviours. That's absolutely true. If you think about our definition, it's cornerstoned on this idea of the patterns of behaviour. So yes, a culture plan must address those organisational behaviours. Is it business-led? A lot of people have said yes to that. And undoubtedly, the answer is yes as well. In that, what we've found is the more it's driven and led by folks within the business, the greater the chance that there'll be ownership, and through that ownership, we'll see better results. To the extent that we've worked with clients and we perhaps haven't got the traction that we might have hoped for, it's been because senior leaders in the business haven't got behind and involved in the process. It must also target organisational beliefs. Those behaviours don't happen in a vacuum, and typically they sit on top of a series of universally held beliefs within the organisation. We know if we work with a mining company, they may say safety is king, but the folks in those businesses may believe that production is king and we must get tons out the door at any cost. And as a result of that, that disconnect between the belief and the behaviour means that the culture perhaps doesn't reflect the things that the firm would hope. Is it a detailed program and delivery plan? Now, this is a bit of a controversial one because different organisations will handle this in different ways. But our belief is and the work that we'll do with clients is to develop a culture change strategy and roadmap. And that provides an indicator of the types of initiatives and the types of programs that you might put in place. And there's some high-level plans associated with that. But those detailed plans and implementation programs are best developed by the organisation using the strategy as a guide. Now, we can support in the creation of the development of those detailed program and delivery plans. But when we think about culture change, we're thinking about a culture strategy that would sit alongside a business strategy, and the two must work in concert. And in the same way that deep in the organisation, you'll take your organisational strategy and develop detailed plans about how that's enacted, similarly with the culture plan. Yes, it's very much focused on those high level, the initiatives with the highest possible impact. We've found that doing few things really well will have a much greater impact than doing many things not so well. So we try and strive to have 5 or 6, as an example, high-level initiatives, not 16 or 18. Again, the controversial point here around the strategy, the communication strategy and plan, there may be some elements of how you might do the communication within those high-level initiatives, but the detailed comms plan and strategy comes later in the same way that those detailed program and delivery plans do. And it's definitely not a long list of culture initiatives for the reason that I highlighted earlier. So hopefully that's starting to lift the veil on how we at Walking the Talk think about culture planning, and more important, developing a culture strategy. Let's unpack that a little bit further and look at those ideas in a little bit more detail. So how do you go about building a plan? Well, what we've found is that culture change, for it to be successful, you really need to pick up and action 6 big rocks of culture change. Let me just take you through those 6 rocks. So the first one is working with senior leaders and helping them become role models of the culture that you're after. We're working with a number of clients currently, and the starting point is always with senior leaders. Because what we've found is if the senior leaders get involved, if they deliberately role model the behaviours of the target culture, there's a much stronger chance that that will then cascade and permeate through the business. So we start with senior leaders. Senior leaders can't do it on their own though. Middle managers, the managers of people, also need to be brought into the tent, and they need to be supported in how they may action the strategy, the culture strategy, but also act as role models. So they really have 2 key roles. They need to think about how to implement the culture strategy once it's developed, but they, at the same time, need to be role modeling the behaviours of the desired culture. But they can't do it on their own. We also need people deeper into the organisation, perhaps those that don't have leader in their title, but they lead by their character. And if we can support those folks in becoming ambassadors of the culture, supporting it, talking about it with others, showing others the right behaviours, that's going to go a long way to driving the culture in the direction that you want. So you can see these first 3 rocks are all about helping people at various levels in the business become true role models and ambassadors of the culture that you're trying to create. And that's really working at that behavioural level that we spoke of earlier. What we also need to do is to start thinking about the symbols and systems. And it's in the 4th and 5th rocks that we start to do that. We start to think about, well, how do we embed these behaviours in the sort of business as usual processes? So you might look at your training systems and ensure that they're helping people develop the appropriate behaviours, beliefs, and ways of thinking to support the culture. You might look at the REM structure that I spoke of earlier, but ultimately what you're going to try and do is look at the key business systems and align them to the culture that you want and ensure that they're encouraging the right behaviours and discouraging those that are not as helpful. And you'll start looking at quick wins. What can we change quickly? For example, it may be that if you're trying to build a more customer-centric organisation, you might have a quick win where you issue a mandate that every meeting throughout the business has to have at least 10 minutes in every hour speaking about the customer and bringing the customer's voice into the meetings. That's a quick win. Takes next to no time, takes next to no money, but it's hugely powerful and hugely symbolic, because if we weren't talking about customers before and now we're spending 10 minutes in every meeting, that says to everyone, customers are more important in this new culture. And finally, this is where your detailed comms plan comes into place. You would develop other ways to accelerate the transition to the new culture through staff engagement and other comms. So they're the 6 big rocks. When we develop a culture strategy, we speak to each of these rocks and support clients in how they might navigate each of those spaces. So how do we go about creating this culture change strategy and roadmap? There are 4 key phases, if you like. The first is to truly understand the business imperatives, the strategic business imperatives of the firm. So we would typically do that by speaking to senior leaders, doing a bit of a desktop review. But in doing that, what we would do with the senior leaders is design the target culture. What culture do we need given our strategic business imperatives? So that's what happens at a very high level in the first phase. In the second phase, what we need to then do is to get some insight, particularly insight around the current culture. We need to understand what's going on, what behaviours are currently normed across the organisation. What are the beliefs that underpin those behaviours? And we combine those 2 elements, the target culture that we've developed in the first stage with the diagnostic of the existing culture to create what we would call a culture blueprint, which is essentially a from and a to. This is where you are today. This is where we need to be. They're the first 2 phases. The third phase then is to say, well, okay, if we know where we are and where we need to be, how are we going to close the gap? And we'll identify a series of high-level change initiatives. But having those initiatives isn't enough. We need to think about the prioritization of those initiatives and the sequencing of those initiatives. You can't do everything at once. So what's going to give you the biggest bang for buck and there's the most appetite for, that'll be prioritized. And we'll also develop a maturity curve. This is where we expect to be at the end of year 1. This is where we expect to be at the end of year 2. And these are the initiatives that are going to take us there. And finally, because this is an enabler of strategy, it isn't a soft and fluffy thing, we need to measure our success. We need to know that we're getting the culture that we want through these initiatives. So there needs to be a series of metrics and some governance put around this so that we can ensure that the culture strategy is delivered with the same level of discipline and rigor as the organisational strategy, because the 2 things really need to work in concert. And through that, hopefully, we'll end up with the culture that we're after. No questions? I'll keep diving along then. So where to from here? So what are our tips? So what are the 5 big tips that we have for organisations that are seeking to undergo a process not dissimilar to this? You must start with a detailed diagnostic. If you don't have a really clear picture of where you are, it's very hard then to shift. Yeah, you really do need to understand the patterns of behaviours and beliefs in a really intimate way so that you can design appropriate initiatives to shift away from that. We can't do all things all at once, so we do need to prioritise in the way that I spoke of in just a moment ago. What's going to have the biggest impact, and you might consider what's the time it's going to take to complete this initiative? What's going to be the return on investment or the impact? And is there an appetite within the organisation for doing such an initiative? You can't just work on behaviours. So many firms think if we just change the values on the wall and we do a bit of training, we're going to get the culture that we want. Our experience has found that that may give you some traction, but it's not going to transform your culture in the way that you need it. You need to also focus on those beliefs, aligning the systems, and thinking about symbolically how can you signal the new culture to everyone in the firm. You do need to develop detailed culture plans, leveraging the culture strategy that we might help you create. And that should be done down to the country, business unit, or function level. Now, again, we can support those functions or those business units as they go through that process. But when we initially work with clients, it's to develop that culture strategy and roadmap. This is a supplementary piece of work because this is about execution rather than direction. And as I mentioned a moment ago, there's got to be some metrics and measurement to support the process and to know that you're on track. So there are our 5 tips. So how do we actually go about doing this with a client? We've sort of told you why and what it is, but how do we get there? There are 5 key steps, if you like. When we've done the diagnostic, we know the from. We've designed the future culture, the to. So we have the from and the to. We know the gap. So how do we close the gap? Initially, we would take all of that diagnostic work. We'd look at a whole lot of data from within the firm, and we would come up with a series of high level of initiatives, 5 or 6, for example, that are going to help close the gap between your from and your to. Now, we do this based on our experience. Over the 30 years that we've been working with clients, we've developed a database of initiatives that we know are effective, that we know can help, and we match those to what we know about where you are and where you want to be. So we come up with, if you like, a draft set of culture initiatives that will close the gap from the from and the to. What do we do then? We have either a half day or a full day workshop where we get in the room with key decision makers. They may be process owners, they may be key leaders, they may be SMEs. And we share with them our high level initiatives. And we build on them, we tweak them, we massage them to ensure that they're going to achieve the outcomes in the firm that we're working with to the best of their ability. Sometimes we add a new initiative and drop off another one, but ultimately at the end of that process, what we have is a set of initiatives that have been aligned to the context of the organisation, not just from our experience and that database that I spoke of. But those initiatives need to be examined even more closely. Are they going to have the impact that we hope they will? What's the time that's going to be required to bring them to fruition? what's the impact going to be, and what appetite is there within the firm. And what we'll then do is not just have the initiatives, we'll have a sense of their impact and how they might be sequenced and how they might be prioritised. So if you like, what we now have is a culture change strategy and roadmap that needs to be endorsed. So what do? We put it to the executive team, and we will present that with the SMEs and the process owners. We don't do it on our own because we need it to be business-led. And there's a discussion around that high-level culture strategy. And hopefully at the end of that process, it's endorsed. And then finally, as I said, our culture strategy is a high level. It does need to be taken down a level so that it can be implemented and executed. And that's typically done at a local level. And if needs be, we can support it. I can see that there's a hand up. Lorraine, did you want to answer a question there?
I'm going to ask a question, so maybe you might like to answer it, Ian. Thank you for taking us through that. I've got a fabulous question here. Is what would you say are the more useful measurement and metrics to assess against when it comes to culture? So I'm going to give that to you, Ian. I think you're the expert on this.
Thanks, Lorraine. That's wonderful. I mean, there are a number of different ways you can think about this. So how might you measure whether you are having the impact that you want? Well, each of those initiatives will have a set of metrics around them, and there'll be a way of measuring that return on investment. So there's that. But what we also need to keep a track of is the culture shifting? And we can do that in a variety of ways. One of the ways we can do it, when we do the initial diagnostic of the current culture, we can run a culture survey, and that can create a benchmark. And we can run that again in 6 months' time, 12 months' time, to see how things have shifted. Other ways we have done this, we have looked at clients' engagement surveys, and we've highlighted the questions that are most strongly indicators of the culture that's trying to be created. And again, we can go back historically and create a benchmark, but then in subsequent engagement surveys, we can tease out those specific questions to see the trend over time. So there's 2 or 3 mechanisms by which we can start to track the progress. The other things that we can do, we can look to existing KPIs or balanced scorecard measures within the firm that again we think are going to be good indicators of the culture shifting. And we can again create a benchmark and track that over time. Hopefully that answers the question. If not, please just stick up your hand again and throw the question back out. I'm happy to elaborate on that a bit further.
Maybe I might just add, Ian, just before you go on to this question. Thank you. That was always a very comprehensive response. One of the other ones, which is a bit of a longer term measure, is of course your business outcomes and your business results. So obviously that's the aim and the overall objective of what you're trying to shift and change. And in our experience with the organisations we've worked with, as well as obviously tracking how we're tracking along the way with those metrics that Ian shared, we're also trying to look at what's happening where the challenges were initially and how is that shifting and changing over time. So we often will see that over time, organisations, when they've come to us because there's a problem with audit or there's a challenge around growth in the business, when they go and look back at the results, the business actually as a result will grow. So that's very, very key. And some of you that might have been on the How Do You Measure Culture session that we ran as the first masterclass, when we do run our Culture Insight survey, we actually can give you a culture health score. It's one score from a range of a whole load of data. So on its own, I don't think it's the right score just to rest your efforts on, but it is also a score which some organisations quite like to be able to put a number, which is part of the balanced scorecard. So that is just another metric that goes in there, and it's an outcome, it's a measure that comes from the survey. So back to you, Ian.
Thanks, Lorraine. So just to wrap things up, just to perhaps summarise what we've covered. So when we think about what a culture strategy and roadmap is, it's really a way to change the way that people show up. Ultimately, if you're going to shift culture, you have to shift the way that people show up. So that's the sort of primary goal and drive of this whole process. We also can't just change behaviours. We have to change the belief systems that underpin them. What we're really hoping to achieve is a tipping point. Our experience has shown that if you can get approximately 35% of your organisational population aligned to the culture, it creates a culture tipping point. The subconscious peer pressure, the zeitgeist within the firm starts to build its own momentum, and folks want to get on board rather than be excluded from the process. And it's very much focused on 5 or 6 high-level initiatives that we think are going to have the biggest impact rather than a laundry list. And it's really not an attempt to address everything within your culture. It's about trying to address the things that are going to ensure your strategic success. It isn't a detailed delivery plan. That does need to be developed, but we've found that it has to be, it's best developed at a local level, at times with our support. It's not a long list of initiatives. You dilute your effort, you'll dilute the outcome. And as much as a communication strategy and plan is required, when we work with clients, we might support them internally to develop that, but it's not a part of the culture strategy and roadmap itself. So there is another question, which is fantastic because we've got to the Q&A component of the webinar. Lorraine?
Perfect. Thanks, Ian. We've got quite a number of questions, so we'll divide and conquer, I think, with these. So the first one is, can you talk a little bit more about the role you play in local activation and supporting the change? Why don't I get you to take that one, Ian?
Fantastic. Well, how to think about this? We will always support the organisation to the extent that they need it and they have an appetite for it. In some instances, Lorraine and I have worked together in quite a detailed way with organisations at a local level to develop plans. The other way we can do it is to, if you go back to the big rocks, there was those that were champions and influencers. We can spend a great deal of time almost, if you like, helping them become internal consultants. And we love doing that because we want to teach you how to fish. And if we can set those folks up with a similar sort of knowledge and understanding of culture as what we might bring, they're even better placed to help develop those local plans, and we might just review them rather than help do them, if that makes sense. So it really is a bit of a continuum. In some firms, we do nothing, and at the other end of the continuum, we will get down and help you create those very detailed plans and anything in between. So hopefully that answers the question. Next.
Fabulous. Great, thank you. I might take this one, Ian. What are the facets of culture assessment, and how is that different from employee engagement surveys? And that's a fabulous question. We get asked this very regularly. Surely my engagement survey tells me what my culture is like in my organisation. And here at Walking the Talk, we will argue that the answer is culture does not equal engagement. In other words, engagement will give you a sense of the sentiment and what is going on in your organisation today. And in actual fact, it's probably a lag measure, but also it's more of a pulse check, or what we would call a climate measure about what is it like working there. Where a culture assessment is quite distinct from that. And it's more about, as you remember earlier on, what are those patterns of behaviour that are being encouraged and discouraged in your organisation today? And what are the beliefs that are driving that? So it is quite different. They are linked, but engagement, as I said, is much more of an outcome measure of the culture that you have. What is the experience like as a result of that culture? Where a culture is a deep dive, culture assessment is a deep dive into what's actually playing out in the organisation that's leading to those engagement results.
Yeah.
And so I think that's enough. Do you want to add to that, Ian?
Yeah, the key thing there is that the culture is the patterns of behaviour. The engagement survey may tell you what it feels like to work there, whether it resonates for people, whether they connect with the firm, whether they would recommend it to their friends and colleagues to come and work there. But the engagement survey won't give you that detail about the patterns of behaviour, and it is unlikely to tap into the beliefs that underpin those behaviours. So when we measure culture, it's very much focused on measuring those behaviours and beliefs. And that in many ways is the distinction. So thanks, Lorraine, for
Great. Well, maybe
illuminating
you'd
that
like.
point.
Fantastic. Well, why don't I give you this question, which is tightly linked to what you just described, Ian, which is, do you have an example of where it was changing beliefs rather than the behaviours that shifted the culture?
Oh, that's a great question.
Mm.
Can I go back to the mining examples? We worked with a global miner that was trying to develop a stronger safety culture, and they had gone down a path which many firms go down, the training, the values on the wall, that type of approach to shifting the culture. We did a really detailed cultural diagnostic that included, almost a score of focus groups across the firm. And what we found was that there was a set of beliefs that directly contradicted the behaviours that were animated through the values. So what we did do with them was develop a series of initiatives that specifically tried to target the beliefs. So, for example, I mentioned one earlier, production is king. That was the belief that was driving the behaviour, that they had to sacrifice safety on the altar of getting tons out the door. And so what we did, we came up with a series of really symbolic initiatives that highlighted when production had been shut down for safety reasons, as an example. And over time, through that initiative and others, we were able to shift the beliefs that unlocked the behaviours that were necessary. I'm not sure if that answers the question. If it hasn't, please just let Lorraine know, and I'll expand on my answer.
Great. Got a few questions here, which is fabulous. Thank you for these fabulous questions. I'm going to jump ahead to one of them because it still stays on the topic of beliefs. A follow-up question, is it important to measure beliefs? And if so, how do you do that?
Well, that's a really great question. It is very hard to measure beliefs in any sort of ongoing structured way. As I intimated just a moment ago with the previous answer, the way that we typically get to beliefs is through focus groups. We might say, what behaviours do you see? And then we might ask follow-up questions. Well, why do you think that is? Why do you say that they're the prevalent behaviours? What motivates people? And it's through that sort of secondary questioning that we're able to identify the beliefs. So it then becomes very difficult to measure that in an ongoing basis, because conducting a series of focus groups is quite difficult. You could argue, if you were measuring the behaviours that were associated with the beliefs and you saw differences over time in how those behaviours were showing up through surveys, for example, you could then sort of extrapolate backwards and say, well, if we're seeing shifts in the behaviour, undoubtedly we've seen a shift in the belief. But the only way to know that definitively, the most practical way to know it definitively, is via focus groups.
Great, thanks, Ian. And just to add to that one, we did work with a healthcare client over a period of about 4 years. And unusually, we don't often do this. We ran the focus group approach twice, once and then 2 years later. And we did notice with some of the areas that they needed to work on that a number of those belief patterns had actually shifted over time as a result of the plan. So we do know it happens and it can work. Next question is, how often would you check in and review this if this process is working? When is what is it that decides a pivot is needed?
Yeah.
So
So
you want to start in? Yeah.
yeah, I'll kick off and then you can pick up
Great.
the pieces at the back end. Now, if you remember when we spoke about this earlier, we were saying that this culture change strategy needs to be aligned to your business strategy. And typically what we would recommend, whenever the business strategy is reviewed, you need to also review your culture change strategy to make sure that the two things continue to be aligned. So if, for example, you go through a large strategic review every 3 to 5 years, you might do this in a large detailed way in the way that we explained. Typically what then happens in the sort of the preceding years 1, 2, before you get to 3, when you redo the whole thing. If you remember, we spoke about this idea of maturity curves and sequencing the initiatives. So what you would do when you review your strategy after year 1, you would review the progress of those initiatives. You would review the impact via the metrics to make sure that you are still on track. And if you weren't getting the outcomes that you were hoping through those metrics and measures that we spoke of, you may then go back to the culture strategy and tweak it and think about how you might massage the initiatives that you'd signed up for to make sure that they're still driving the change that you want. Lorraine?
Right. Yeah, fantastic. Got 2 more. We're right on time, so feel free to stay on for those of you if you'd like to ask more questions. Ian and I are happy to stay on to the top of the hour. But if people need to drop, we totally understand that as well. So the next question is, and we spoke about this, Ian, earlier on, culture does not change overnight. What would be a reasonable amount of time to measure the change?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So you can measure, there are 2 types of assessment we would do: process assessment and outcome assessment. So you can do process assessment after 6 months. Have we done the things that we were going to do? Have we ticked off the things that were in our plan? That's measuring to make sure that the inputs are occurring. But you may not see wholesale change in the culture itself for up to 12 months. We have worked with firms, though, that have seen traction in less than 6 months. So it really does depend on the starting point, what's their existing culture, where they want to end up, their endpoint, their target culture, how big the gap is, and the nature of the initiatives that are going to close the gap. So, in short, you can get some traction and perhaps see some change within 6 months. But in other instances, to really nail it and see lasting change, it may be more like 12 or 18 months.
Yeah, great. Fantastic. Thank you, Ian. And as we sort of draw to a close, this is the last question. If anybody else has a question, just pop it up now, your last chance. Any chance you have an example culture plan that you could share with us?
Oh, that's a very good question. So a couple of things here. First, we're always bound by the confidentiality agreements that we reach with our clients. So it's unlikely that we'd be able to share an actual culture plan. We can share examples that have been de-identified that would give you an indicator of what you might expect. So we have that collateral, and we're more than happy to share that if you're interested. It's just awkward to then be sharing real culture plans for the reason that I described. So hopefully that answers the question, Lorraine.
Yeah. And I think as we, I hand back to you, Ian, for closing. And if people want to know more, we're very happy if you reach out to us, one-on-one, to have a more detailed, more intimate conversation with you around what your needs might be, but also maybe able to share some of those examples that Ian mentioned. So there's no more questions, Ian. I'll hand back to you.
Fantastic. I hope you found that interesting and perhaps a little bit informative. If you are interested in any follow-up, having a chat with us about what you're hoping to do with your culture to get some examples of the work that we've done in the way that I just described, please just reach out. We'd love to continue the conversation if that's going to be of value to you. Thanks very much for your time this morning, folks.